Okay, we're going to be taking notes over chapter 25, section 4. This chapter really talks about the different ideas in economics and in reforms that were taking place during the Industrial Revolution as England was industrializing. It just really focuses on these new ideas that started to come out during the Industrial Revolution. The first person we're going to talk about is Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a very famous economist. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And Adam Smith had some pretty revolutionary ideas that contributed to the idea of capitalism and free market economies. Adam Smith really agreed with the laissez-faire philosophy. The word laissez-faire actually means, and it comes from the French expression let do, or let the people do as they please. The basis for laissez-faire economics is just the industry owners and the business owners really should set their own working conditions without any interference for the government. So it was really a let the business owners and the factory owners set their own conditions and their own wages without any kind of government regulation. Adam Smith defended the free market economy or free enterprise economy, and in 1776 he defended these ideas in his book called The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations just kind of basically argues that economic liberty guaranteed economic progress, and the government really did not need to interfere with the economy. And as you guys may have heard of before, Adam Smith is he is famous for his invisible hand theory. And this theory basically means that the government needs to not interfere in any part of the economy, and that the economy pretty much will work on its own. And it's as if by an invisible hand, meaning that there's pretty much an invisible hand making everything work, and that the government doesn't need to be involved. This led to more thinkers named Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo to come up with the system that we well know as capitalism. Their ideas were the foundation of capitalism, and we know that capitalism or free enterprise is an economic system in which money is invested in business ventures with the goal of making a profit. We should be pretty familiar with this system of economics because that's the system that we have here in the United States. And it was these ideas that sparked the Industrial Revolution that started in England. Thinkers in favor of capitalism really opposed any kind of government involvement in the economy. And we just talked about it. What was this principle called when there was no government involved in the economy? That's right. It's the laissez-faire policy that was supported by Adam Smith as well as Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. So they came up with these ideas of capitalism. Opposing capitalism, we get to the system of socialism, and we have actually talked about socialism in different ways. We discussed socialism when we talked about the Incans. If you remember back to the Mesoamericans, the Incans kind of pioneered a form of socialism. They believed that the government, that everyone should work for the better good of the government, and the government will serve you. And this is where we kind of get that idea of socialism. Socialism really started to take height during the Industrial Revolution. Socialism just means that the factors of production, which we talked about on Monday, land, labor, and capital, they are all owned by the public, and they operate for the welfare of everyone. This idea really grew because of the optimistic view of human nature that people were good, and people would work for each other, and if everyone would work together, then everything would be good. And it also came from concerns with social justice. People started to argue that the government really should plan the economy and not allow free market capitalism, because free market capitalism had a tendency to let the rich get rich, and the poor would oftentimes stay poor. The main goals of socialism were to abolish crime and poverty and to promote equality among everyone. So socialism was really an idea that since the public owned everything, everyone would be equals. There would be no one getting incredibly rich and no one being incredibly poor. So that was really the main goals of socialism, were to kind of get rid of poverty, to rid the streets of crime because there would be no more poverty, and to really promote this idea of equality. And also it was believed that public ownership would help workers, because during this time, as we talked about, the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the workers were being taken advantage of and were being paid poor wages. So they felt like that this would remedy that problem. He's cut off, but that's okay. You can kind of see him. One very important person in the life, or in the view of socialism, was Karl Marx, and he introduced Marxism. And Marxism was just his ideas on a socialist kind of government. He wrote the Communist Manifesto, as well as Das Kapital, which were both works. He wrote the Communist Manifesto with another man named Friedrich Engels. But they argued that people have always been divided into social classes, and that the wealthy controlled production while workers controlled the labor. And Marx really felt that the Industrial Revolution had abused the poor and made the rich wealthier. So he really wanted to focus on equality, and he thought that capitalism promoted the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So his ideas came from the fact that he wanted to show equality for the workers, and he didn't like what the Industrial Revolution was doing for the wage earners. He came up with his idea of communism, and he was able to do that by, he had a theory that the capitalist system would essentially destroy itself. He said that the factories would eventually drive out the small businesses and the small artisans. The large working class, or the proletariat, would revolt and seize the factories and the large businesses, and they would produce what society needed. At that point, the workers would bring out economic equality, and the final phase would become what is known as communism. And communism is a form of socialism, which means all means of production would be owned by the people. And Marx really believed that private property would no longer exist, and all the goods and services would be shared equally. And that's really what his pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, that he wrote with Friedrich Engels, that's really what it talks about. And it really did start a couple of revolts in Europe, but in the 1840s, 1848, 1849. But the European leaders were eventually able to put it down. But his pamphlet was really instrumental in causing revolts in Vietnam and Russia and China and Cuba. And so we still have people who have Marx's belief systems today. So Marx, in his pamphlet, really talks about the inequalities that were taking place in the Industrial Revolution, and trying to fix those by creating equality. Another thing that comes from the Industrial Revolution that we still have today are labor unions. And unions are just voluntary organizations that workers usually would join, and they would come together in order to get reforms and better conditions for their profession. And unions are usually divided up by profession. And so, for instance, you have like unions of electrical workers and unions of steel workers. So these unions would get together and they would try to fight for better wages and better working conditions on behalf of their workers. The unions would engage in what is known as collective bargaining, and that's just negotiations between workers and their employers. And the best example I can think of is, if you remember this past summer, the NFL and their players union took place in collective bargaining, which were just negotiations for, negotiations to be in player contracts. So that was kind of something that we can relate to today. Like I said earlier, they usually bargained for better working conditions, higher pay, and a lot of times if those things were not granted, the unions would sponsor a strike. And these strikes would a lot of times really benefit the middle class people, because the middle class people could not be replaced as easily as the poorer, low-end workers. So unions really had their place in the Industrial Revolution, and they were able to get a lot of things changed. They were able to pass a lot of laws and have a lot of changes made in order to change the way working conditions and wages, and especially when they talk about child labor, the unions were very instrumental in getting laws passed in order to end that. Labor unions were a lot of times seen by the government as a threat, and they were threatening the social order and the stability of working, so they've had some different viewpoints on labor unions, but they were very instrumental in helping make reforms and get reform laws passed in the place during the Industrial Revolution, and we probably have talked about these or you have heard of them before. The abolition of the slave trade was led by William Wilberforce, and we talked about him last unit, but he was able to completely abolish the slave trade coming out of England, and he was very instrumental in that. The women's rights, women in Britain as well as in the United States were trying to gain the right to vote. Women did not have the right to vote. They were fighting for suffrage, and suffrage just means the right to vote. I know when you hear that word, you might think suffering, but it just means the right to vote. Also, different reforms were being made in the in the world of public education, because a lot of the children were sent to the factories to work. People started to see the need of public education and a way to educate our students in order to get them out of the factories and into a better workforce. Horace Mann, he's known as the father of public education. He is the reason why you guys are in the system that you are. He really fought for education reform, and he pioneered public education reform in Massachusetts, which led to the first public schools. Okay. Make sure that you come to class with these notes all written down. If you have any questions, you may let me know, and I will see you guys in class on Wednesday and Thursday. Have a great day.